In this explainer, we're diving into the essential writings on race, a collection of essays by the late Samuel Francis, put together by Jared Taylor. Our job here is to simply lay out the core arguments from these texts, using the material itself to map out his worldview. So let's get into it.
All right, here's how we're going to tackle this. We've broken it down into 5 parts. First, we'll look at the man himself, Samuel Francis. Then we'll explore what he called a civilization in crisis. After that, we'll dig into his proposed solution, the Reconquest, and then get into the ideological roots of his ideas before we wrap it all up.
So first things first, to really get a handle on these writings, you kind of have to know who the author was. So who was Samuel Francis? Well, the book we're looking at presents him as a pretty important, though definitely controversial thinker. Now, this timeline shows a really distinct career path. Francis started out in very mainstream conservative places, the Heritage Foundation, working for a U.S. senator, and the Washington Times, where he was actually winning awards. But then you see this huge shift in 1995 when he was dismissed from the paper. That was a major turning point. For the last 10 years of his life, he wrote for more dissident outlets, where, as the book notes, he felt he could write exactly what he thought without any constraints.
And this quote from Jared Taylor, the book's editor, really frames how his supporters see him. He's not just a writer in their eyes. He's a theorist who was willing to pay a heavy professional price to say what he believed about race. This context is pretty crucial for understanding the ideas we're about to jump into.
Okay, let's get into the real meat of Francis's work. It all starts with his diagnosis of what he saw as a full-blown existential crisis, a threat to Western civilization, and more specifically, to the white race. So before we can even talk about his solutions, we have to understand what he saw as the problem. What was the central threat in his eyes? Well, he described it as a quiet, but very real, transfer of power, a shift away from one civilization and race to others, which he believed was happening right here in North America.
And he pointed to what he believed were very specific signs of this displacement. Things like the rise of multiculturalism, attacks on historical symbols like the Confederate flag, and creating new ones like Martin Luther King Day. He argued these weren't just random events. He saw them as part of a coordinated cultural war. He was also really focused on pop culture, claiming that movies and TV had started to routinely cast whites as the villains, creating what he called an anti-white ethic.
And this right here, this is absolutely key to his whole argument. For Francis, this wasn't just about culture. At its core, it was about biology. This quote gets right to the heart of it. He believed that civilization is a direct result of the genetic traits of the people who created it. So in his view, if you displace that founding race, the civilization itself is doomed to collapse. Okay, so if you believe there's this massive existential crisis, what do you do about it? Well, Francis was very clear that, in his view, a specific proactive plan was needed for survival, and he gave that plan a name: Reconquest. This slide really lays out the 2 paths he considered. On one hand, you have racial separatism, this idea of creating little white-only areas. He totally rejected that, calling it a strategy of surrender. He basically saw it as giving up on America and its history. Instead, he pushed for reconquest, which to him meant reestablishing white cultural and political control over the entire country. So what did this reconquest actually look like? Well, he laid out a pretty clear 3-step plan. First, he said whites needed to develop a strong, explicit racial consciousness. Second, he called for action to counter what he saw as demographic threats, so halting immigration and focusing on birth rates. And third, he wanted to tear down political structures like affirmative action and civil rights laws, which he believed gave power to minority groups. So where does all of this come from? What's the foundation for this kind of thinking? Well, his essays go deep into a very specific theory of history and race, and it's all built on his concept of the Aryan people. Okay, we need to be really clear about a term you'll see here. When Francis uses the word Aryan, he's very specific that he means the Indo-Europeans. In his writing, he identifies this group as the branch of the Caucasian race that went on to populate Europe and North America, and he argues that they have their own unique fundamental characteristics. So according to Francis, this Aryan group has what he calls 3 core traits baked right in. The first is a belief in a cosmic order, this idea of an objective truth that leads to things like science and logic. Second is a Faustian dynamism, which he describes as this innate drive to explore, to create, to conquer. And third is individuality,
which gives rise to this heroic ideal of the individual standing alone. Now, for Francis, these aren't just cultural quirks. He argues they are innate racial traits that fueled all of Western civilization's major achievements.
All right, let's pull all of this together. When you boil it all down, what's the one big takeaway from all these essays? It really comes down to a single, very powerful idea about how race and civilization are connected.
Ultimately, Francis's entire case rests on this one core thesis, that race isn't just a feature of civilization, it's the biological foundation for it. He argued that the unique accomplishments of the West grew directly from the specific genetic makeup of European peoples, and because of that, those accomplishments simply cannot survive without them.
And this final quote from him, wow, it really sums up his call to action. He ends one of his most important essays with this incredibly stark warning, which is his spin on that famous line from Benjamin Franklin. For Francis, racial unity wasn't just a good idea. It was an absolute necessity for survival in what he saw as a constant racial conflict.
And that brings us to our final thought. The writings we've just walked through present a very clear, very detailed origin story, a myth about where people came from, what makes them unique, and what their destiny is. It kind of makes you think, doesn't it? How do these kinds of foundational stories end up shaping a group's identity and their political actions, even now?